So for people who read the title of Value Flywheel Effect, some people may be confused. What do you mean by that? Do you have like maybe one statement pitch or value proposition? What is Value Flywheel Effect? And how do you get the inspirations from?
Yeah, well, it's really around the thing I noticed was the business technology divide. So that was apparent in many companies. And a lot of companies have got on this kind of wave of cloud and moved to the cloud. And then the value maybe has not been there. Companies are maybe treating the cloud like someone else's data center. It's just a fancy data center. So to get that real value, you have to really join the business and technology strategy. So the idea of the value flywheel effect is when you join business goals with technology goals, you start to see this momentum, this flywheel effect. So it's obviously influenced from the Jim Collins's flywheel effect concept, which is brilliant, from good to great. And then Jeff Bezos also had this Amazon's virtuous cycle, which is a really nice kind of flywheel. And really, with the value flywheel effect, what we found is there's 4 phases. The first being clarity of purpose. It's like start with why. If we need to be extremely clear that from technology and business, we know what our North Star is. And there's techniques to help people figure that out. The second phase is challenge. You need to create the right environment that we can challenge each other in the team. We can challenge how we're going to achieve that North Star and set ourselves up for success. The third phase is next best action. Once you're pretty clear on where you're going and you've got the right environment, you will execute quickly. And for me, that's bringing in some of the modernization techniques around serverless, etc., and serverless first. And then the fourth phase is long-term value. You can't build to throw away. You need to have a really solid understanding of what good looks like. So for me, that's a problem prevention culture, which is around well architected and sustainability. How can we build, but build effectively for the long term, not just build quickly? So that is a flywheel that will continue to turn. It's not just one and done. Once you start that momentum, and it builds very rapidly. It's like a rocket ship. And then one of the things that you end up doing as you implement that is removing inertia, removing sticking points. What is slowing down that movement? Because as you well know, the move to the cloud, it's not one and done. You're on an acceleration journey that gets faster. You need to change how you think and how you act.
So if I can probably simplify a little bit for people, you take the concept from the flywheel effect from Jim Collins and also the Amazon virtual cycle. So what I can relate is that it's an iterative process. It's not like one big bang journey where people now becomes transformed, right? Either moving the technology to the cloud or the business becomes digitalized or something like that. It's a virtuous thing. It's a flywheel. That's why. And also it's like a lot of things that you need to alignment from business and technology. So it sounds like it's very similar to some other techniques, which are also well-known things like agile software development or agile business transformations, or it could be also DevOps or Dev whatever ops these days, right? So what actually stands out from value flywheel effect that probably is different than the other techniques?
Well, there's a mindset that for me is across the whole thing about being extremely collaborative. The main tool that I used as we created this value flywheel effect is a technique called word-relay mapping. And word-relay mapping, for me, it's a complete game-changing technique. When you start to map these different phases, it gives you clarity on what you should do and what you shouldn't do. I can explain what word-relay mapping is. For me, it's really about that idea of strategy and what should we do next. It's not business strategy or technology strategy. It's what do we as a team need to do next. And word-relay mapping gives you that insight, creates that environment that you can build that alignment. I discovered this probably around 10 years ago. There's a researcher in the UK called Simon Wardley. The story was he was a CEO of a technology company, and he realized when he got the position of a high growth technology company as CEO that all the strategy was nonsense in his terms. He didn't think it was deep enough. So he came up with this idea of word-relay mapping, and it starts with the canvas. So the canvas has got an X and a Y axis. At the very top, there's like a value chain. So at the very top of the value chain, you've got a customer. It always starts with the customer. And what's that customer's need? So then there's a chain under the customer need for a component, which is customer might need, for example, something like a cup of tea. So the customer needs a cup of tea. So then what does a cup of tea depend on? It could be like a kettle, hot water, some tea. You start to build out a value chain of what things are dependent to solve the customer need. So as you think in your head of a value chain going from top to bottom, the y-axis of the map is visibility. Things at the top of that chain are very visible to the customer. The customer is aware of the cup of tea, but they may not be aware of the kettle or electricity further down that value chain, but they're very aware of, they can see the cup of tea. And then from left to right on the bottom, this is the kind of exciting part. That's where the x-axis is. And this is really the evolutionary axis. For the evolutionary axis, there's 4 areas. So the first is genesis. So every component will evolve in its capability. I'll explain that in a second. So genesis is things that are brand new. They're like wondrous. I've never seen this before. It's fantastically new. I don't even know I need it. I've never even thought of this. The next phase is custom. Maybe we understand how we might be able to build them, but we're not very good at it yet, and it's still quite emerging. The third phase is product. Things in the product phase we're starting to get good at building these, and there's a strong customer need. The customer are aware of these things, and they want them. There's customer demand. And then the fourth phase is commodity. So things in commodity, we are very good at building these. We optimize them, and they're basically the cost of doing business. And the customer may understand it, but it's like, yeah, everyone has one of those. The evolutionary axis is what's really exciting. In the cup of tea sort of map, the kettle may be commodity. You know, a kettle is a kettle. It warms the water. The water is likely commodity. The cup may be product. Maybe you have a nice cup, which adds to the experience. And the tea could either be something very bland, like a standard type of tea, or maybe something very kind of like a high quality tea. That's a real differentiator. So that could be more revolutionary. And then every single component will evolve from left to right. So if we think of computers, when computers started being used by business in the 60s, it was this thing of wonder. It was actually in the newspaper when a company got a computer. There's photographs of a computer being delivered to a company. Custom is probably more like the 70s and 80s, where there was lots of different types of computers, but they were all kind of different and non-standard. And then as we moved into the PC era, it became product. Computers everywhere, they're kind of standard, getting different features to solve the need. Now with cloud, they've moved it in commodity. It's not a big deal. Everyone has a computer and you just rent one from somewhere. It's not a really differentiator. So using that technique to figure out cloud strategy, business strategy, engineering strategy, it gets really interesting to figure out what's the customer need and then what does that depend on. And we can figure out what are the things that we need to get really good at, the things that we can rent from elsewhere. Serverless being a great example, that we can actually rent a lot of the compute and services from a cloud provider and not have to build them ourselves.
Thanks for sharing this high-level overview about Wardley mapping. I'm sure like for people, maybe the first time you hear it, you probably don't get it. I would suggest looking at the canvas itself. It will definitely give you a much better picture and analogy what David is talking about.
There's a great site by a guy called Ben Musur called learnwardleymapping.com. Ben's got some great videos where he explains this because you kind of need to, as you say, you need to see the canvas. So I would look at learnwardleymapping.com.
And I also have a previous episode as well about Wardley mapping. So please do check it out. In that episode, we talk about Wardley mapping, DDD, and some other stuffs. Please do check out. So one thing about Wardley mapping that I realized, especially when you look at these websites, they always say that you will improve your situational awareness within the organization, be it in the business and technology. First of all, how do you actually improve your situational awareness and why it is important for organization to do so?
That's a great question, actually. One of the things that we started to realize with myself and some of the architects, if I was to sit and write a PowerPoint or a document about what I think we should do, I would go off by myself, write that and present that. Because I've maybe spent a week writing that or putting that together, if they give some feedback, it feels like they're being critical of my work. So that becomes slightly awkward sometimes, especially if it's a PowerPoint. Somebody's in doing a presentation with a map. Several architects might sit down or several experts and start to map out in a collaborative manner. What do we think those things are? And as you're performing the action of mapping, you start to build situational awareness. Because people say, oh, we need X. And no, we don't. We need X and Y. Why do we need that? So it becomes a more to and fro conversation. You create the environment where you can challenge and build each other's knowledge. It becomes less confrontational. So this is the idea of building situational awareness. So what you're really doing is having a structured conversation, trying to find out what's happening across the organization and what do we need to do. So it's a great way of building trust within a team or a group of people and getting that situational awareness, because you can't have people sitting like writing documents all day and writing PowerPoints or writing loads of code, because what you're not doing is exchanging information. So that idea of mapping is a great way to build situation awareness because you're having more collaborative conversations about how do we need to solve this problem.
So it is not just about notation or new techniques, modeling techniques, where you come up with a different kind of ways of representing what you want to do, but it's actually also the collaboration part, exchanging information, or what you also call maps, different maps. At the end, I think the deliverables will be a strategy for the organization to execute. So it could be for a short period of time, or it could be also for a long-term period of time.
Yeah, the outcome is almost like, what shall we do next? Throw the map away. The map represents a story. You're not creating a model. It's a thinking tool. It's a bit like the saying about plans. Planning is useful, but plans are useless. So the idea of the action of planning is very important, but once that plan comes into effect, you got to think on your feet.
Yep, I've heard about that phrase as well. I forget exactly the quote, but yeah, I heard about that. So you will fail if you don't plan, right? But once you plan, you can toss the plan because in the real battlefield, so to speak, the plan doesn't always work. So you always need to adapt.